Okay, here we go. All right, everyone, I think we'll get going now. This is a colloquium talk by someone for their dissertation. So faculty, please remember to use your evaluation forms for this. We are currently streaming live. So hello, anyone out there in the live audience. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce Srijana Bhattarai, who comes to us with a master's and bachelor's in environmental science from Tribhuvan University in Kathmandu, and a master's in geography from Virginia Tech, where she started exploring land use and land cover patterns and malaria in Nepal. And then she came here to continue her wonderful work in Nepal, which we will hear about today in her talk, Evaluating the Progress of Malaria Control and Effectiveness of Vector Control Interventions for Eliminating Malaria from Nepal. So take it away, Shri.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. Hello, everyone. I'm Srijana Bhattarai. Today, I'm going to talk about my dissertation for the colloquium, and the title of my talk is Evaluating the Progress of Malaria Control and the Effectiveness of Vector Control Interventions for Eliminating Malaria from Nepal. My research falls under the subdiscipline of medical geography, which explores the issues related to disease and health, employing geographical concepts and techniques. Within medical geography, my study involves the study of vector-borne diseases, in particular malaria. Vector-borne diseases are the diseases that are transmitted from one person to another by vectors such as mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, but the actual disease-causing agents are the pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, and parasites, etc. For my dissertation, I'm studying one of the oldest vector-borne disease, which is malaria. Malaria is transmitted by the female Anopheles mosquito, and the actual disease-causing agent is the parasite called Plasmodium. Malaria has been a significant public health burden worldwide since a very long time. Millions of people are affected by this disease every year with hundreds of thousands of deaths. In the map, you can see the parts of the world where malaria transmission occurs currently. My dissertation motivation, Nepal is a malaria endemic country in South Asia, and currently malaria cases are declining in Nepal, and Nepal is preparing for elimination by 2026. For the success of the Nepal's malaria control efforts, it is essential to analyze the achievements of the recent years and to identify the challenges ahead. A key piece of this is to identify the changing geographical distribution of malaria risk and evaluating the effectiveness of the current vector control interventions. This assessment will show how well the program is doing in different places and which places needs additional efforts. This assessment is important because malaria eradication failed in both Nepal and globally in the 1970s. So the larger objective of my doctoral dissertation is to assess the progress of the malaria control, identify the changing geographical distribution of malaria risk, and evaluating the effectiveness of vector control interventions in Nepal. And I'm accomplishing this task by using data from government and other agencies, using methods from medical geography, including geographic information systems, spatial analysis techniques, and statistics. So for this, I'm working on these 3 projects, and today I'll be talking about these 2 projects in detail next. The title of my first project is Spatio-temporal patterns of malaria in Nepal from 2005 to 2018. Nepal has achieved significant progress in malaria control, especially after the introduction of long-lasting insecticidal nets in 2004. So malaria cases declined from over 4,000 cases in 2004 to a little over 1,000 cases in 2018. And Nepal also achieved the goals of Rollback Malaria Program and Millennium Development Goals for controlling malaria. And both of these goals were made in 2010 instead of 2015. And currently Nepal is at malaria-free elimination stage, aiming for elimination by 2026. However, there are studies which have shown that Nepal is observing an increasing proportion of Plasmodium falciparum malaria and imported malaria cases. There are reports of malaria increasing in some high-risk districts in spite of the vector control. And some studies have also shown that malaria is expanding to new areas which were previously not endemic for malaria. So for this project, the objective is to analyze the space-time pattern of malaria in Nepal from 2005 to 2018, following the introduction of long-lasting insecticidal nets. The objective is specifically to identify areas with unusually high or low temporal trends of specific malaria indicators: indigenous malaria, imported malaria, Plasmodium vivax malaria, Plasmodium falciparum malaria, and total malaria. So indigenous malaria is the malaria that is reported to have been acquired within the country through local transmission. Imported malaria is reported to have been acquired outside the country and reported after coming back to the country. Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium falciparum malaria is, so malaria is transmitted by 5 different species of the Plasmodium, and these 2 are the most important ones, and these 2 are the ones found in Nepal. And total malaria is the sum total of all these different malaria. So the data I used for this project are the malaria cases that I obtained from the annual reports of the Department of Health Services. Data is from 2005 to 2018. And another is population data, which I obtained from the census report from the Central Bureau of Statistics. Population data was from 2001 and 2011, and then I extrapolated the population to other remaining years. For analyzing the spatial and temporal pattern, I used a method called Spatial Variation in Temporal Trend, which was performed in SAT-SCAN software. This method is based on Martin Kultok's scan statistics, which detects areas with exceptionally different temporal trends. This method identifies clusters with increasing or decreasing rates as compared to the outside of the clusters, and evaluates if the differences between them are statistically significant. This method produces primary and secondary clusters. Primary clusters are the ones which have maximum likelihood of happening, and the remaining ones are the secondary clusters. So the results, so I first plotted the malaria indicators for the whole country in a bar graph. And what I found was that all of the malaria indicators are declining, they are decreasing, right, with some fluctuations. And this is great for Nepal, which is, coming closer to elimination. However, the spatial variation and temporal trend method found several clusters of malaria indicators which have increasing trend, as well as some with decreasing trend. For the decreasing trend, even though the rate is decreasing, the rate is much lower than outside of those clusters. So the clusters with the red shades are the ones with the increasing trend, and the blue ones with the decreasing trend. So let's look at them one by one. For the indigenous malaria, so there are 4 clusters with increasing trend, and the most significant one is this one. And it has increasing rate of 113.71%, which is really, really high, and very, very concerning for Nepal, right, for the elimination program. And another interesting thing about this cluster is that this cluster lies in the mountainous region of the country. So it means it is cold, and it was previously not endemic for malaria. But now the local transmission or the establishment of malaria transmission in this region means that maybe climate change is uh, creating this situation, right? Imported malaria clusters. So there were 5 clusters with increasing trend. And again, there is this cluster which has very high rate of increasing imported malaria case with 156.22%. And the interesting thing about this is this cluster has Kathmandu, which is the capital of the country, right? So there is lots of people, migration of people going in and out this country. And another is PV malaria clusters. There was 1 cluster with increasing trend and 3 with a decreasing trend. But as I said earlier, even though these clusters have decreasing trend, the rate is not as much as outside of these clusters. For PF malaria, there were 3 clusters with increasing trend. And for total malaria, there were 2 clusters with increasing trend. So discussion, although there is an overall declining trend for malaria indicators in the country, there are several clusters with increasing trend of malaria and decreasing trend, but slower than outside of the clusters. So the increasing trend of malaria indicators is very concerning result for a country which is coming closer to the elimination deadline. And the decreasing trend, even though it sounds good, it is not that great. So these places also need special attention from the public officials. Another result was that PF malaria declined overall in the country much further than PV malaria between 2005 and 2018. This result is in agreement with the WHO report, which says that PV malaria is difficult to control than the PF malaria because the vector control interventions, which are the long-lasting insecticidal nets and the endoresidual spraying, are more effective against PF malaria than PV malaria, because in areas where PV malaria is where it lies, the mosquitoes bite early in the evening, and they obtain blood meals outdoors, and they also rest outdoors. So those vector control interventions which are applied inside of the house are not effective against them. So PV malaria may pose a significant challenge for malaria elimination in Nepal. Besides the vector control interventions not being effective against them, they also have the issues of asymptomatic infection, and they are also difficult to detect in the blood test, and they have also issue of relapse, which means like person infected with the P. vivax malaria, they might not show the symptoms now, but after months or years. So this may pose a challenge for malaria elimination. Imported malaria, so all of the clusters except one had an increasing trend, and one of the cluster had very, very high rate of increase. And another thing is there are clusters in the western part of the country which also have imported malaria increasing highly. The case with the western part of the country is that a lot of people from the western part of the country, they go to India for work as a seasonal migration, and India is endemic for malaria, and they come back for the major festivals in Nepal, and which coincide with the malaria season after the monsoon. So imported malaria is a challenge and threat to the achievement of maintenance of malaria elimination, because imported malaria can always initiate that local transmission, and it can always initiate the establishment of malaria locally. And studies have shown that the epidemiology of the imported malaria has changed in Nepal recently. The percentage of imported malaria in total malaria was below 20% in 2002, and it has increased to 50% by 2012. So the limitation of the study, first the spatial analysis were limited to the district level because the data is available at the district level, so it may not represent the localized pattern within the district. The second limitation include the use of routine surveillance reporting. So there is always concern about the completeness of such data. And third is population of the districts were projected and may have led to over or underestimation. Second project, the title is Future Malaria Transmission Suitability in Nepal under Climate Change and Comparison with Non-Areas of Risk. So climate change affects malaria transmission. With climate change, change will occur in spatial pattern of the areas suitable for transmission, as well as the seasons of length suitable for transmission. And studies have shown that climate change is already affecting the spatial pattern of the disease in different parts of the world. And so other studies have projected the shifts in the malaria transmission pattern in the future with the climate change. Although there are some studies which have studied the impact of climate change in malaria transmission in Nepal, no study have examined the future scenario of malaria transmission with the climate change in Nepal. So we don't know about the changing risk of malaria in the future. But there are some areas of non-risk at present. So the government of Nepal classified the districts into 4 categories of malaria risk: high risk, moderate risk, low risk, and no risk, based on the annual parasites of incidence, which is total malaria cases per 1,000 population. And this classification was done to prioritize the vector control interventions. So vector controls are mostly concentrated in the high risk districts and then moderate risk districts with little or no focus on the low risk or no risk districts. So malaria is, according to this classification, malaria is mostly endemic in the southernmost part of the country, because here the climate is subtropical, warm and humid, very suitable for mosquitoes, with the northernmost part of the country not suitable for malaria because it is where the mountains are, so it is very, very cold, not suitable for mosquitoes. And we have also identified a changing risk for malaria in our previous chapter. So we found several clusters with increasing trend of malaria indicators. So in this project, what I did is I predicted the malaria transmission suitability with climate change in Nepal with the temperature dependent mechanistic model by using the thermal suitability from Galena et al. And then compare the future pattern, this future pattern with the known areas of risk. So I used the thermal suitability for malaria transmission from Galena et al. Paper. What they did was they studied the effect of temperature on malaria transmission by these 2 parasites, Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax, by 2 vector species, Anopheles gambiae and Anopheles stephensi in Africa and Asia. So I used the thermal suitability they calculated for the Asia for stephensi and with those 2 parasites, and I projected them into the climate models to access the malaria transmission suitability for combination of stephensi and Plasmodium falciparum, ASPF, and Anopheles stephensi and Plasmodium vivax, ASPV. So the objective of this project was to access malaria transmission suitability in Nepal at the baseline climate and predicted climate for ASPF and ASPV, compare the suitability between the baseline climate and predicted climate, and to compare the future climate predictions with the known areas of risk. the one governmental defined malaria risk categories and the clustered malaria pattern that we found in our previous chapter. The climate data of two rasterized temperature data layers were used for the analysis. The first data set to represent the global baseline climate data from the World Clim. These data represent the mean climate conditions for a period of 30 years from 1960 to 1990. For the future, I used general circulation model, the Hadley Center Global Environmental Model version 2, Earth system configuration, under the two greenhouse gas emission scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, and for the years 2030 and 2050. The method, so for mapping the malaria transmission suitability, the gridded temperature data of the baseline and the future climate scenarios month-wise, they were constrained to the thermal range of the optimal quantile of transmission, and that generated pixel-wise monthly binary suitability. So pixel would have either 1 or 0. 1 is they are suitable for transmission and 0 is not suitable for transmission. And they were summed to get the number of the months of the year suitable for transmission. Then I created a category for defining the suitability. So if a pixel is suitable for transmission for 10 to 12 months of the year, I called it endemic suitability. Similarly, 7 to 9 months of the year, seasonal suitability. 4 to 6 months of the year, moderate suitability. 1 to 3 months of the year, marginal suitability. And 0 months, it's unsuitable. Then I compared the results from the baseline climate and predicted climate to see if the suitability has changed from one category to another, and also compared the future patterns with the known areas of risk, the government defined and the clusters from the previous chapter. So the result, this is the malaria transmission suitability at the baseline climate and for the future climate. So this is for RCP 4.5, RCP 8.5, and 2030 and 2050. So if we look at the baseline map, what we can see is the malaria transmission suitability is endemic in the southernmost part of the country, and the suitability decreases as we move towards the north. And in the northernmost part, it is not suitable for malaria transmission, right? It looks like what we saw in the government defined risk categories also. And in the future, what will happen is the suitability will extend and move towards the north. So here you can see the dark blue pixels are like expanding and moving towards the north. Similarly, other pixels are also expanding as well as moving towards north. So the results are similar for RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. However, between 2030 and 2050, the results are more pronounced in the 2050s with more increase in the temperature. So what actually changed? The significant scenarios of changes are seasonal to endemic, moderate to seasonal, marginal to moderate, and unsuitable areas to marginal, moderate, and seasonal. And I group these changes into two categories as extending suitability and emerging suitability. So extending suitability is the areas that were already suitable for malaria transmission, and they are now extending their suitability to higher categories. And emerging suitability is the places they were not suitable before, and now they are becoming suitable as marginal, moderate, or seasonal. So these two maps are showing the extending suitability for 2030, for 2050, and these are for emerging suitability for 2030 and 2050. So in this map, this pink pixels are the areas which change from seasonal suitability to endemic suitability. And the purple one, this purple color here, they are changing from moderate to seasonal, and the black one is marginal to moderate. These changes will be more in 2050s. And similarly for the emerging suitability, the grayish pixels are unsuitable to marginal, the orange unsuitable to moderate, and the red unsuitable to seasonal. And these changes are also more pronounced during the 2050s. So these changes are, so this is the map for ASPF under RCP 8.5. So these changes are similar for ASPVL also, the 5X combination as well. The only difference that I found between ASPF and ASPV is that for ASPV under RCP 8.5 in 2050, there are some significant shrinkage in the suitability, meaning the endemic areas will convert into seasonal areas, or the endemic suitability is changing to seasonal suitability. So these areas were suitable for transmission for 10 to 12 months of the year, but in the future, they'll be only 7 to 9 months suitable. So it may be because the temperature will increase in like some months to an extent which is higher than the threshold good for malaria transmission. Then comparing the risk, first I compared the government-defined risk categories with the increasing clusters of malaria indicators from my previous chapter. So this one is PF malaria cluster compared with the government risk, and this is for PV malaria. So here, excuse me, there are 3 clusters with increasing PF malaria. So these clusters include 3 categories of government risk: moderate risk, low risk, and no risk districts. For PV malaria, it includes moderate risk and low risk districts. So both of these do not include high risk districts here. It may be because high risk districts have vector control interventions in place, right? But the other risk categories like no risk and low risk districts also being in the cluster with increasing malaria trend is a concerning thing for Nepal. Comparison of the future patterns with government-defined malaria risk categories. So these are extension of suitability and emergence of suitability. So the extension of suitability is occurring in all of the risk categories: high risk districts, moderate, low, and no risk districts. And the emergence of suitability is occurring in low and no risk districts because they are like in the northernmost part of the country, right? So so this means that the government has defined certain districts as high, low, and no, but in the future, the risk areas are going to change. So in all of those categories, there will be, malaria transmission happening. So the government needs to revisit their risk categories, right? Again, similarly for the PF clusters, so the extension of suitability is occurring in all of these 3 clusters with increasing PF trend. And the emergence of suitability is occurring in one of the cluster in the northernmost part. So the clusters, these clusters are the ones that we found in a previous chapter as new areas of risk, right? And so the extension of suitability, emergence of suitability in the future, coinciding with our previous chapter's result, means that the change that is already happening is also due to climate change, which will extend in the future also. Similarly, for the PV cluster, also the extension of suitability will occur in this cluster of increasing PV trend. So discussion. So in this chapter, we access the baseline and future geographic distribution of malaria transmission suitability in Nepal and compared the future distribution with the known areas of risk defined by the government and the clusters from our previous chapter. So the result was that the geographical distribution of malaria transmission suitability in the 2030 and 2050 varied compared to the baseline climate. So there are emergence of areas with emergence of suitability, extension of suitability, and also shrinking of suitability. A similar study done by Ryan et al. In Africa also found those conversion of suitability from one category to another, like endemic and seasonal suitability becoming unsuitable, and vice versa, unsuitable areas becoming endemic and seasonal. Another result we found in our study was that suitability will extend towards the cooler areas in higher altitudes. And there are studies which have similar results in different parts of the world. And it is because of the climate change, the cooler areas are warming up and becoming more suitable for the mosquitoes. Another result in our study was that both PF and PV malaria will increase the suitability in Nepal in the future, except for PV malaria, where it will shrink its suitability during 2050. A study by Hundesa et al. 2018 found that the PV and PF malaria will increase in percentage in the future with climate change in China. Our study have identified reasons with the emergence, extension, and shrinking in seasonality. So the public health officials can focus in these areas for the vector control interventions. The emergence of suitability, it means the area was not suitable for malaria before and now becoming suitable. So it means the people, they didn't have any immunity towards the disease and didn't have any knowledge about prevention or treatment. So these people will be very, very vulnerable. So these places needs vector control interventions in place. Extension of suitability means people will be exposed for malaria for a longer period of time. So the vector control interventions that were in place, they need a revision, right? Because the area will be affected for a prolonged period of time. So vector control should also be there for a longer period of time. The areas with the shrinking suitability, so they provide opportunities for additional control and even elimination. So Nepal is currently preparing for elimination, and these potential future scenarios of malaria transmission suitability, the emergence, extension, and shrinking should be incorporated into the planning of vector control interventions and other malaria management programs. The limitation of this project was that the results are based on the temperature range of the Anopheles stephensi and the malaria parasites. So Anopheles stephensi is not a major malaria vector in Nepal. The major malaria vector of Nepal is Anopheles fluviatilis, but the studies have not conducted to calculated the thermal range suitable for malaria transmission by this vector, because there are no lab studies that have studied the thermal traits of this vector. And so we used Anopheles stephensi because it is a Asian malaria vector. It's an urban vector and which is expanding its range very, very fast. And it is found in neighboring India. Some old literatures of entomological studies in Nepal have mentioned the presence of this vector in Nepal as well. So the conclusion from these two chapters, we have identified two approaches to understanding the changing malaria risk in Nepal, in a country which is approaching towards elimination. We have identified the changing areas of risk that is already happening through the clusters of increasing malaria indicators, and which is predicted to happen in the future. So in addition to the malaria risk areas identified by the government, the public health officials should also take into consideration these changing areas of risk for malaria management programs in order to reach the goal of elimination, as well as for preventing the resurgence of transmission after elimination. Because even the goal of elimination is achieved, there is always possibility of resurgence of malaria, because the main risk factors for malaria transmission, the climate is suitable in Nepal. And another risk factor, migration of people who can always initiate that local transmission is present. So there is always possibility of the resurgence, and thus these changing risk areas should be considered for the future malaria management programs. This is all what I have. I would like to thank the Department of Health Services for making those data available. And I would like to thank my committee members for guiding me throughout this dissertation project, especially my advisor, Dr. Sadie Ryan. And I would also like to thank my lab mates and my department colleagues. Thank you so much for listening, and I will take any questions that you have.
Does anyone have questions in the audience online? You can unmute and ask.
I do.
Okay.
This is Esther. Hi, Shri. Thank you for that really fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
So I, in a former life, I worked a lot with climate models, climate change models, and in climate services. And so one of the recommendations that we always had, even though for some it was a little impractical, was that you never use just one climate model. The reason being that climate models, they all, there's kind of a, climate model architecture is fairly similar across the board, but the way that climate models project different variables and the larger scale atmosphere and all the stuff is quite different between them. So in my work, I've noticed that particular Hadley model that you used is fairly hot, at least in the US, maybe not, I don't know what it is globally. But I'm just sort of wondering if you were able to have used, let's say, 6 climate models, how might that have changed some results and therefore the implications of your results in terms of the sort of the part at the end where people are having to make decisions based on your information?
What can be the implication of using one model versus like combination of others?
Yes.
For that, frankly, I would say, like, I don't know. So I haven't used the combination of other models before. This is my first time of using like model predicting future. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I would like to explore this like implication of you're using one versus like combination of others.
Yeah, because it being a hot model, it may well be showing you more changes than other models might. And we cannot say for certain which model is right or wrong. Or, you know, so that's another thing, just to be aware that the climate model don't predict futures. They're not like something that will happen. It's something that we're fairly certain that the temperature's warming. So I have no concerns with what you found. It's just more like the intricacies of it and how different models can tell you a fairly different story sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Audrey has a question. Do I yell at the speaker?
Yep. Hi, Shri.
Hi, Audrey.
I was curious, are the PV and PF malaria mosquito species, are they endemic to that area, or are they sort of, because you were talking about the Asian malaria vectors, and I was wondering about when you're looking at the habitat shrinking or increasing. Basically, I was wondering, are those two mosquito vectors endemic to the area, you know, indigenous to the area, or are those like imported basically in the main, and what the main vector is in Nepal?
Sorry, I didn't hear you properly. Can you come closer, maybe?
I was wondering, because you were talking about that Asian vector mosquito species, I was wondering about the PV and PC mosquitoes, and are those indigenous or endemic to Nepal?
So the PV and PF are the parasite, the Plasmodium parasite.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay,
so they are the parasites that cause malaria in Nepal.
The vector the Asian vector that you modeled, that's the species of mosquito?
Anopheles, yeah. So
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Go on.
I was wondering what the dominant parasite is, malaria parasite. And then I was also wondering, when you had those four categories, imported, indigenous, PV, and
PF.
Yeah, PF. Like, for instance, can one be imported and PV? Can they possibly?
Yeah.
How would you account for, so if it's imported and it's also PV, for instance, which category do you put that in?
I did not classify those like into imported PV or imported PF. So all the imported and the indigenous PF were PF for this analysis, for this study. Like PV were 1 and PF and 1, and like imported and indigenous were like all imported and all indigenous. They could include both PV and PF.
Okay, I see. Thanks. Just curious.
Is that all? Your question?
Gabby has a question for you. She's running to the microphone.
I'm coming up front. Do you know anything about the vector control that's happening in India, as that might have implications for the maintenance of endemic malaria along the southern border of Nepal?
So in Nepal also in India also the major control interventions are the bed nets, long-lasting insecticidal nets, and the indoor residual spraying with insecticides. I think the problem with India is it is very huge, and of course it is very, very warm. And thus, I think it is the major endemic country in Asia. India is so I think they are doing, but because of its like vast area and the like open border with Nepal and India, so the imported cases will always be a problem unless India can reduce or eliminate malaria.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any more questions from our online audience? Any more from our live? Anyone? Okay, well, I think if we can thank Shri again for her wonderful presentation. And we just got the storm rolling in here, so it's a good time to wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody run for your cars. Great job, Shri.
Thank you.